Well, there's two key things to note here. The first is that the time between when Cleveland Dodd first phoned officers over his cell intercom to when he was found unresponsive inside his cell was a much longer period of time than what the government has told us. And secondly, there were a series of mistakes made, both individual and systemic, which not only failed to prevent Cleveland Dodd from taking his own life and attempting suicide, but also compromised their emergency response. So on the first point, the sequence of events, the Corrective Services Minister here, Paul Papalia, has told the public that it was only a matter of minutes from when Cleveland spoke to officers to when he was found unconscious inside his cell. But the ABC has seen documents which show it was actually much closer to 13 minutes. Cleveland Dodd spoke to officers on two occasions, on two separate calls just a few minutes apart. On both of those calls, he threatened to hang himself. On the second one, he even told the guards how he was going to do it. In between those two calls, an officer did check on Cleveland. He was doing routine cell checks within the wing, within the prison. It did not appear that that officer was aware at that point in time of his suicide threats, and he only speaks to him for fewer than 20 seconds. He then goes on to continue to speak to other detainees within the wing of the cell. On that second call that Cleveland made to officers, when he told him how he was going to do it, the officer responded by telling him not to say those things. It would then be around another 9 minutes before that officer, who had had that short conversation with him, would walk back past Cleveland's cell and discover him hanging. But he wasn't carrying a radio, so he wasn't able to immediately help. He couldn't call an emergency code red, and he also couldn't call for the cell to be opened. So he had to leave, collect the keys from his duty manager, and finally, once he got inside the cell, no one would call an emergency code red for another 6 minutes, and Cleveland Dodd would finally leave Unit 18 in an ambulance almost an hour after he made that first call to officers over his cell intercom in which he threatened to take his own life. And there were also other mistakes made in this process.
And what were some of those?
Look, in the weeks, days and hours before, there were several systemic and individual failings. All detainees are meant to be visible at all times via CCTV cameras that are inside their cells, but Cleveland had covered his during that afternoon. So he was out of sight to officers for close to 12 hours, and we understand that there were no attempts made to remove the covering from his camera. Officers also have to complete physical welfare checks of all detainees every 15 minutes. They have to do that either via the cameras within the cell or in person. The form that had been completed for Cleveland showed it had been filled out right up until 6 a.m, despite the fact that he had left 3.5 hours earlier in an ambulance in a critical condition, which suggests that his form had been filled out in advance of any actual physical checks taking place. The weeks before Cleveland attempted this suicide, he had self-harmed. He was put on a at-risk list, which means that there's additional surveillance of his behaviour to make sure he doesn't do anything like that again. But he was removed from that list just days before this fateful moment. And lastly, and possibly most crucially, a ceiling vent within his cell that he would ultimately use as a weapon against himself, was damaged. We understand that no detainee should have been housed within that cell until it had been fixed. And we also understand that contractors had attended on several occasions to try and fix it, even the day before he took his own life. The work had not been completed, and it's unclear why that is the case. So as you can see, there were many failings that failed to prevent the Cleveland Dodd taking his own life on October 12 this year.